So in the final section of The Way of Forgiveness, Father Fuentes outlines 9 concrete steps on the path to forgiveness. And they are controlling our anger, correcting certain ideas, awareness of goods received, sharing the painful memories with Jesus, working on our understanding, practicing compassion, transforming painful memories, the lessons we can gain from forgiveness, and finally the difficult step of forgiving. So as we've said before, these cannot be rushed, but rather work through peacefully and prayerfully, and ideally with a spiritual guide, preferably a good and holy priest. Here we'll just examine 3 ideas for correction. The first, myself. What is my view of myself? Perhaps I'm selfish and proud. Do I demand that I be the center of attention? Do I think that the world revolves around me? St. John Vianney said that our pride will not leave us until 15 minutes after our death. That is, we will always struggle with pride. So this is something natural to all of us, natural as a result of our wounded nature, we can say. Or perhaps I'm a negative person, and this is something too that many struggle with, this idea of feeling that I'm worthless. What is the truth? First, we are made in the image and likeness of God, as we read in the first chapter of Genesis. And we see after the creation, He saw it was very good. We know that we were created out of love. Gaudium et Spes from the Second Vatican Council of the Church says that man is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself. And this is by God who is love, as we read in the first chapter of John's first letter. We can know and love God and enter into a real relationship with Him. Despite our sin, we know that God is good and His mercy endures forever. He created us, but also sent His Son, born of a woman, to redeem us from our slavery to sin. We know that God knows each one of us personally and that He desires our eternal salvation. And lastly, something very fundamental that is so easy for us to forget is this idea that we are not infinite. Meaning what? We are not God. Meaning we are not the source of our own happiness. We only can find our happiness in God. So we need to have this appreciation, this understanding of the real situation we find ourselves in, which is a dependent creature, dependent purely on God, a God who loves us and wants the best for us. That can change our entire view about who we are and what we're made for. Second, we have to correct the idea of our neighbor. So perhaps I've been wounded by another, as we've said before, a family member or a loved one, and I hold a grudge against them. But what is the truth of this reality? We have to try to see things concretely. What is the truth of this reality? My neighbor is an image of God. He's made in the image and likeness of God, we can say. Did not Christ die for my neighbor too? Like me, my neighbor is not God. Do I expect perfection from my neighbor, which is impossible? Do I expect something that cannot happen? Just as I cannot be perfect without God's grace, and not at all in this life, neither can my neighbor. My neighbor has defects like me. Does that surprise me? Something very important for us to consider is we don't know the interior life of our neighbor. Maybe we see certain things happen, but we don't know why he did it. So often we think people do things to us out of anger or spite. Perhaps it's carelessness. Perhaps there isn't the malice that we assume is there. We have to try to see the truth and understand what we do know and what we don't know. And the reality is, when it comes to our neighbor, there's much more we don't know that's going on in the soul of our neighbor. God has forgiven me. Ought I not to forgive my neighbor? And we can think of in Matthew's gospel the parable of the unforgiving servant, right after Peter asks, how many times must I forgive? 7 times 77. Christ tells him 7 times 77, and then Christ goes on to give Peter the parable, and the disciples and us, of the unforgiving servant who's forgiven an immeasurable debt by his master, but then when he turns to his fellow servant, is merciless and cruel, demanding the payment of a very, very small amount. It makes no sense. We have been forgiven by God. We too must forgive our neighbor. And the last idea that we often need to correct and perhaps the most important, is what is my idea of God? Do I hold a grudge against God? Am I angry at God for the evils I see in my life, in my friend's life, and in the world? This is a very crucial step in the path of forgiveness. And fundamentally, it comes down to working on seeing our image of God as Father. And this is something that Father Fuentes actually dedicates another book to, Meditations on God the Father. But something for us to consider, this idea of, do I see God as a strict judge or as a loving Father? Do I see the mercy of God in my life? We have to work on something that Saint Therese of Lisieux is very famous for bringing to light, and which has made her a doctor of the Church, this idea of spiritual childhood, where just as a child puts all of their trust in God, their loving Father, knowing that their Father in heaven will take care of them, so we too must do that. So often we see this dependence in children. They rely on their parents for everything. They don't even think about it. Of course I'm dependent on my parents. But then as we get older, we think, okay, now I can take care of myself and I got it. Spiritually, no. Spiritually, we become more dependent as we grow in the spiritual life, seeing that everything we have is received from God. Everything. And so when we can develop more and more this spiritual childhood and see God as a loving Father, it can transform our entire reality. So when we work on our understanding and begin to try and put into practice to really make concrete this compassion, both to ourselves, to forgive ourselves for the wrongs we've done, knowing that we are weak creatures dependent on God's grace, and practicing forgiveness and compassion to others, because like us, they too are weak and dependent on God's grace and prone to, since the fall of Adam and Eve, our first parents, prone to sin. This idea of forgiveness, this ability to put into practice forgiveness, will little by little become something much easier for us. And we can just briefly recall the story of Joseph in Genesis and his brothers who try to kill him, decide to sell him into slavery, and yet eventually he's able to see it all as part of God's plan and forgive his brothers. And may we too, by learning more and more, by correcting these false ideas that the world and the devil wants to place in us of ourself, our neighbor, and God, may by the correction of these ideas, we be more disposed to forgive ourselves, to forgive our neighbors, and to see God as He truly is, a kind, merciful, and loving Father. Thank you very much, and God bless you.